Alright guys, how's it going? It's been a curious week in the tech industry with Intel releasing their new server CPUs, their Purley Xeon range, based on their new Skylake SP server architecture. Now we've already seen Skylake X, the desktop versions of those low core count server CPUs. Before taking a closer look at these CPUs and also how they compare against AMD's new Epyc CPUs, we'll take a short step back in time to 2004 and an article over at Fortune called Chipping Away at Intel. November the 1st, 2004, which was soon after AMD had launched their very successful Opteron server CPU. Now talking about AMD, the article states, by employing its own chip design innovations and exploiting strategic missteps by Intel, AMD has built alliances with the likes of Microsoft, Hewlett-Packard, Sun, Fujitsu and IBM. Now today you might look at that and think, well, what's the big news there? But back then this was actually big news. Back then a lot of these companies were fearful of Intel and AMD were just a tiny nobody player. They were seen as a second source to Intel, but no real threat. And due to that, these tech powers mostly ignored AMD, but now they saw the chip maker as a means to build market share by helping customers lower the cost of their IT operations. Almost overnight, AMD had become a major supplier of chips in the high-priced and high-margin world of servers, the big machines that power the internet and corporate networks. And in a grudging acknowledgement of AMD's prowess, Intel this year changed its technology strategy to copy the design of AMD's hot new server chip. Now by hot, they mean hot in the good way, instead of the other version of hot, which we generally use today when talking about CPUs. But AMD has always been a company that struggled for consistency. But after 3 years of losses, the company had racked up 4 consecutive quarters of profit. Now you might think for a business that's nothing great, and you'd be right, but this is a profit and loss pattern that AMD has been following for decades. They lose an awful lot more money than they make, and some people wonder how they can still be going. But at the time, their CEO Hector Roos said this company is in the strongest position we've ever been in. And Nathan Brookwood of the Insight64 tech research firm said AMD has some serious performance advantages over Intel. Further down the article, we can see that reviews for both product and company have been ecstatic. AMD's top-end desktop processors are faster than Intel's for most applications, while another continued that AMD has a better product and lower cost manufacturing. In the history of technology, that's a recipe for a major disruption. And finally, Brookwood of Insight64 again says, AMD has a far superior technical approach, at least near term, than Intel, and that advantage should be amplified over the next 18 months. But for me, one of the most interesting and one of the most relevant parts of this article for this video today was this part here, where it states that Intel tries to avoid even acknowledging AMD's existence. Though today their spokesman Howard Hai agreed to speak gingerly about it. Now this had been Intel's policy for years, decades even. They simply refused to acknowledge AMD's existence. Intel had nothing to gain by talking about AMD, their much smaller competitor. But here we can see that Howard Hai has said, we have great technology and AMD has great technology, but I don't see them as being ahead of us. And he also raised the spectre of the old cycle repeating itself. Right at this moment, AMD's better than they've been in a long time, but that's after a 3-year run of non-profitable years. They tend to have point periods in their history when they are competitive. Now, history shows that this is completely true. That is AMD in a nutshell. Point periods in their history when they are competitive. So will Intel again squash the smaller chip maker? Well, that can't be ruled out, but both inside AMD and among chip analysts, the feeling is that if the smaller company can get 30% of the overall x86 chip market, then they will then be too big for Intel to take out. And back in November 2004, they were around 17% overall. Now this is the server market back in 2004, and AMD was down around 5% or so. But we can also see that over the following years, their Opteron CPU helped them to gain 24% of the server market share. Now Intel still owns, of course, the massive lion's share, but 24% of the server market was still absolutely massive for AMD, and they made an awful lot of money. The last time, in fact, that they made an awful lot of money. So when you hear AMD's executives like Lisa Su and Mark Papermaster talking about their strongest lineup in a decade, this is basically what they're talking about when they last made massive inroads into Intel's server market. Now, the CPU at the forefront of their minds is of course Epyc. Now, I've covered Epyc in a little bit of detail in previous videos, and you know me by now, I'm not one to shy away from controversial statements like "you're beating Intel," and I also stated that I could not see Skylake changing this situation by much. And in the previous few minutes of this video, where I highlighted the parts about the innovation and Intel missteps, then hopefully you could see some similarities between then and what is now happening today. But on Monday of this week, Intel did launch their Skylake server response, along with a 78-page slide deck, all of which you can see over at Computer Base, and I will leave a link in the description to all of these. Now, there were some pretty eye-opening slides amongst this, but it all started off in rather standard fashion, where we saw that Intel was ditching their old naming conventions, they're getting rid of the E7s and the E5s, and have instead introduced their new metal platform. That's Xeon Platinum, Xeon Gold, Xeon Silver, and Xeon Bronze. But moving on to slide 4 and an overview of the Xeon SP, and here we can see that the Platinum goes up to 28 cores, the Gold goes to 22 cores, and then around Silver and Bronze I think the core counts kind of fall apart a bit. Intel tends to segment their CPUs in some pretty bizarre ways, and they usually have a lineup that makes very little sense to the untrained eye, and quite often very little sense to the trained eye as well. But they've gone the extra mile this time with an incredibly confusing lineup. But it's all pretty standard stuff where they're talking about their new architecture, highlighting performance against their previous architectures. There's a bit there on the new mesh, which I talked about in my Skylake X video, and again a bit on the memory subsystem. So this is all completely par for the course. We're 44 slides into the presentation, but then on slide 45 things rapidly go downhill as they launch a scathing attack on AMD's Epyc server CPUs. Now, it all starts off rather bizarrely, where Intel states that Epyc will require software optimizations just like Ryzen, before then going on to quote Digital Trends, who said AMD Ryzen CPU gaming performance is inhibited by a lack of optimization. Now, we've talked about this at length. Ryzen does need optimized for gaming, and we also saw that AMD was taking steps to ensure this happened. But Intel continues that software is simply not optimized for AMD's implementation, and it will likely require a multi-year investment effort to develop, optimize, and validate an ecosystem. On the next slide, they talk about Intel's single die implementation, which maximizes performance and low latency. And then again on the next slide, they compare their holistic data center solution against AMD's repurposed desktop product for server. Now, they have a real go here at the way Epyc is built. You probably know that Epyc is effectively 4 Ryzen CPUs on one package, which Intel claims gives inconsistent performance due to the 4 glued together desktop dies. Now, first of all, let's deal with this whole desktop product thing. Intel's marketing is basically suggesting that AMD's Epyc server chips are just a bunch of Ryzen CPUs, which is of course not the case. Or if it was the case, then this would also be the case for Intel, where their server CPUs are simply repurposed Skylake X CPUs. And we should hope for Intel's sake that that isn't true, given the horrendous performance per watt of Skylake X. But what you're looking at here is just false marketing. The server does of course get the highest quality CPUs. It's the desktop people, us guys, who get the low quality CPUs. So a more accurate statement would be that Ryzen is more like a repurposed server CPU rather than the other way around. And that is of course the same for Skylake X and Skylake SP. Now, AMD also has a poor track record and are an inconsistent supplier, which is something I will talk about in a future video, and also again this lack of ecosystem. On slide 48 we see yet another rather curious slide where Intel is claiming innovation and performance over the past 5 years. Now, these E5-2690s are based on the Sandy Bridge architecture, and I think it's fairly obvious that since that point Intel has not really been innovating and has in fact been offering very minor upgrades in terms of IPC, on the desktop at least. But yes, it is true that they've been offering more cores at least over the years. But here their claim is that AMD's new Epyc servers will have a relative performance around Intel's Haswell processors. And also another curious quote from WCCF saying that AMD's Zen architecture will last for 4 years. Very strange stuff indeed. On slide 50 we once again see the 4 glued together desktop dies, and again this repurposed desktop dies for server, with more talk of inconsistent performance. Slide 51 architecture matchup is very interesting, where we can see that Intel has a fully integrated up to 28 core die compared against AMD's multi-chip module 4x8 core desktop die and a disjointed 8x8 MB L3 cache. And rather than showing the actual bandwidth of the package, And the total memory channels, they instead decide to break it down into the number of channels per die, and once again, a repurposed desktop dies for server. And it continued, slide after slide after slide. On slide 60, we hit the low point of the presentation, where Intel compare their $2,200 Xeon 6134 against an underclocked Ryzen 7 1800X at 2.2 GHz, with the claim here being that Intel has superior SMT based on one or two benchmarks, which we will see later. Slide 61 is yet another low point, where Intel suggests that a vendor lock-in is good by claiming that virtual machines running on Intel Xeon processor compute pools can only live migrate to other Intel virtual machine pools. I'm pretty sure most people would consider vendor lock-ins to be a bad thing for them, and this would actually give you a good reason to switch to AMD instead. And finally, on slide 66 out of the 78, they again repeat the slide that we saw at first, where they expect Epyc will require software optimizations. So after what started out as a reasonable presentation were little more than a hatchet job, a hit piece on AMD's new server CPU, the relevance of which should be obvious, as it is a far cry indeed from the days where Intel tried to avoid even acknowledging AMD's existence. So what has been the cause of this? Well, let's head over to Untitled for a look at some benchmarks. The Untitled article starts off by talking about tensions and chip sizes are rising. That might have been better had it said rising. Now we've just seen the part about the tensions, and look at the massive die size of these new Xeons. These are the 28 core versions, around the same size as a key card, a little bit wider in fact. Of course, Epyc is also an absolutely massive package, but as we've learned is 4 CPUs, rather than being this one massive monolithic die. Untitled have also compiled a table listing AMD's Epyc 2P processors, of which there are currently 9, with the fastest being the Epyc 7601, 32 cores, 64 threads, and a price of $4,200. That is per CPU. And they also list the 1P processors, so these are processors for single socket systems, and a very attractive looking one in the Epyc 755 1P, again with the 32 cores, 64 threads, but coming in at half the cost. A slight drop in the base and all-core turbos, but at the price point it looks an incredibly attractive part. Now, as I discussed earlier, Intel's segmentation is a bit of a mess, and Untitled had talked about this in detail. Also, the first thing to note is the pricing. Remember, $4,200 for the fastest Epyc 7601, but on their pricing comparison chart we can see $10,000 for the Xeon 8180, $12,000 for the 8176M, and Intel had sent Untitled the Xeon 8176, coming in at just under $9,000. This is the CPU Untitled chose as competition for their Epyc 7601. So these are the two CPUs we will see matched up today in the benchmarks. Now before we start though, it should be noted that Untitled only had access to Epyc for 1 week, whereas they had the Xeon for 2 weeks. So their testing time, especially on Epyc, has been limited. For that reason, the BIOS is a little bit immature and they had to run the Epyc RAM at 2400 MHz, which was down on their rated 2666 MHz. The Xeons were running at their rated speeds, but apart from this little quirk with the RAM, everything was pretty much as expected. It's a 2P system, so 2 Epyc 7601s up against 2 Intel Xeon Platinum 8176s. And the first benchmark is memory bandwidth, Stream Triad, and instantly we can see that the dual Epyc's 8 memory channels per socket provides a large advantage over the dual Xeon 8176s, and these E52699V4s is Intel's previous generation 22 core, 44 thread Broadwell E. There's no real surprises here. The Epyc memory bandwidth is indeed epic, coming in at around 25 to 45% ahead of the new Xeons. Latency, however, is a different matter, and we've seen this before. AMD's Infinity Fabric is great, but it's not without its flaws, and the latency between CPUs is rather high. And this is of course where Intel is keen to point out the weakness of the architecture. The latency is really good up to a point, but does become much higher quite rapidly, and could be an issue in latency sensitive applications. Looking at the single-threaded integer performance with Spec CPU 2006, we see that the Intel CPUs have quite a commanding lead. Now this isn't a great surprise. as the single-core turbo, especially on the new Xeon, of 3.8 GHz is quite some distance ahead of the Epyc 7601's 3.2 GHz, but Anantech reckons Epyc is around 90% of the performance of the Intel architectures in IPC. One of the more interesting tests was the SMT integer performance. Now if you remember in the Intel slide where they compared their $2,200 Xeon against the underclocked Ryzen 7 1800X, Intel made the claim that their hyperthreading was more efficient, but Anantech found a different result, where they found that the Xeons picked up around 20% improvement due to hyperthreading, but the Epyc 7601 improved by even more, to around a 28% boost from SMT on average. But next up was the multi-core, and this was one that AMD had pointed out in previous marketing slides, where they claimed that Epyc had a 47% advantage over Intel's Broadwell in integer performance, and Anantech discovered that AMD's claim was not far-fetched, with their discovery of the AMD 7601 being around about 40 to 42% ahead of the previous generation Broadwell, and that it was even about 6% faster than the Xeon 8176. They were, however, keen to point out that they do not believe that the spec CPU rate metric has much value for estimating server CPU performance. The point here is that spec tends to run this benchmark on each CPU. So if you imagine it's filling up the CPU, the L1, the L2, the L3, but there is very little interaction between threads and between CPUs, so in some cases this may well be one of the best cases for AMD. Continuing with the multi-threaded integer performance, Anantech has LZMA compression, where we see the dual Xeon is quite a bit ahead, and also notable that the 7601, with almost 50% more cores than the previous generation Broadwell, can only muster around 11% more performance. Decompression, however, is a completely different matter, and the 7601 is now ahead of the new generation 8176. We've seen this before on the desktop with 7-zip. Ryzen is a little bit weak in compression and much stronger in decompression, and what we basically see here is AMD's superior core count coming through with a win. Now moving on to database performance, and a very strong result for the new Xeon, well ahead of their previous generation, with the dual Epyc 7601 languishing far behind. This, however, was likely worst case for Epyc, as it was a very small database which can be mostly cached in the L3, so it's not really taking advantage of the massive amount of bandwidth and the extra RAM capability of the Epyc. According to AMD, performance should also rise by around 10 to 15% if memory interleaving was enabled, but they didn't get time to test that, so we simply don't know. But maybe this does justify what Intel talks about, maybe just a little bit about optimizations. But to be fair, a database which fits in L3 cache is a very small database, and is not something that you would ever require CPUs on this level to run. Moving on to Java performance and Spec JBB, which is a usage model based on a worldwide supermarket company with an IT infrastructure that handles a mix of point-of-sale requests, online purchases, and data mining operations. And Epyc ekes out a very small win here, only 1%. However, Anantech once again points out that the testing is not the ideal case for AMD, with a more optimized use case coming in around 4 to 5% higher. Next up was Big Data and Apache Spark 2.11, a benchmark taking around 4 hours to complete, and another small win for the new Xeon, but only coming in around 5% ahead of the dual Epycs. Now moving on to floating point performance, and something where we've seen Ryzen perform extremely strongly, and in C-Ray, which is a very simple ray tracer, and likely to be one of Epyc's best results, where it comes in a massive 50% ahead of the new Xeons. This is a highly synthetic test though, and not one that I would put a lot of stock in. Next up was Persistence of Vision Ray Tracer, and once again we see the very strong performance of the Epycs, which comes in well ahead of both Xeons. It should be noted that the Skylake Xeon seriously underperforms here, so this could well be an optimization issue. And finally, a molecular dynamics benchmark, where once again the dual Epycs perform stunningly, simply crushing the competition with 41% better performance than the new Intel Xeon. That was an older version of the code though, and a newer binary showed improved performance on the Intel CPUs, with a slight regression in the Epyc performance. The last thing to look at is energy consumption. We already saw earlier that Skylake X appeared to have a bit of an issue when it comes to power consumption. Now the desktop and the server market is different, and server requires performance per watt. However, looking at some of those Skylake X numbers, it really didn't appear to bode well. And here we can see that at idle, the new Xeons idled at 190 watts compared to 151 watts of the dual Epycs. In the MySQL or MySQL benchmark. The Xeons did come in that little bit more efficient. However, when looking at the persistence of vision ray benchmark, the Epycs were around 130 watts better. Now the thing here is, these dual Epycs are 180 watt chips, so you should be looking at around 360 watts, compared to what should be around 330 watts of the Xeon 8176s. But here we can see that those dual Xeons are pulling 453 watts in persistence of vision ray, and remember, this was a win for the Epyc CPUs. There's little question here that, especially in these floating point workloads, the Epycs appear to be massively more efficient than any of the Xeons in fact. Anintech's summary basically states that AMD's Epyc 7601 offers slightly less or slightly better performance than Intel's Xeon 8176 at around half the cost. However, Epyc's real competition is the Xeon 8160, which they expect will likely offer 15% lower performance and yet still cost around $500 more than the best Epyc CPU. Very much of note is that AMD's single socket offering, that is the Epyc 7551P, would likely outperform many of the dual silver Xeon solutions, and in fact Intel appears to have given up here. This 7551P with 32 cores and 64 threads and only $2,100 is effectively unmatchable. As compared to the competition, which would be two 12-core Xeon 5118s, the Epyc processor has 8 extra cores, a less complex server board, much more PCI bandwidth and a lower TDP, giving AMD a serious cost advantage on paper. There is simply no way that Intel can compete with this CPU, and even the 7410P at 24 cores and only $1,000, it's not unreasonable to expect AMD to take over the entire 1P or workstation market with these CPUs. Intel just does not have the CPU capable of competing here. In many ways, it is horses for courses. There are of course situations where the Xeons are faster, and in certain cases they will be a lot faster. But just how much faster do they have to be to justify the astronomical difference in price? And wherever the price points are near equal, AMD appears to have a huge performance advantage. They simply have more cores at any price point. But it's not just the more cores. They've got more PCIe, they've got more memory channels. Anintech does note that Intel offers lower TDPs and higher turbo clocks, but as we've seen, the lower TDP doesn't really mean anything. They also point out that the 16-core Epyc CPUs in particular seem to have a remarkably high TDP compared to similar Intel SKUs, but the point here would be that even those 16-core CPUs come with the full 8-channel memory and the 64 PCIe lanes, and this is why they have the relatively high TDPs. This is not a case of them being inefficient, it is simply a case of them being capable of more performance under certain workloads, which does require a higher TDP. Had the Intel CPUs also had 8-channel DDR4, and instead of only 48 PCIe had 64 PCIe, then they would also require a similar increase in TDP. The Anintech benchmarks are probably not all that representative of a typical server. This is pretty difficult stuff, and very few websites are doing it. The only real takeaway from it is that certain server loads are going to prefer Intel, while certain loads will prefer AMD. Intel's big problem is their pricing is completely out to lunch and doesn't even remotely reflect their competitive position here. It's going to be really interesting, and this is why they've gone on the attack. That 30-slide hit piece they did on Epyc is simply because they realised their days of their fat margins and high prices are coming to an end. We have just entered a new era of competition, one that has been sadly lacking in the server space and in the desktop space for many years. But make no mistake about it, Intel will not give up 1% of their market without a fight, and as we've already seen, they are prepared to fight dirty for it. I'll catch you later, guys.